Hi, I'm Pastor Matt.
And I'm Mary Rose.
And welcome back to our podcast, Going Through Scripture. We are in the middle of some explanation of the laws, and we're in chapter 22, and we're picking it up at verse 25.
If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset, because the cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? When they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. Do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people. Do not hold back offerings from your granaries or your vats. You must give me the firstborn of your sons. Do the same with your cattle and your sheep. Let them stay with their mothers for 7 days, but give them to me on the 8th day. You are to be my holy people, so do not eat the meat of an animal torn by wild beasts. Throw it to the dogs.
So, one, let's just pause that comment about your firstborn sons you shall give to me. One, this is another place where I think it hints at least at the initial thought was that the firstborn of God's people would be priests. Mm-hmm. We also heard earlier in Exodus, this is not like offering them up on the altar, but being redeemed and being restored for service as God's people. So it's just important to note that. And then
it's a little confusing because it's in the same breath as like offering animals.
Right. And earlier we heard in Exodus that they're all offered, but the firstborn males of people have to be bought back, redeemed from that offering to God, at least in the sense of they can't be sacrificed to him. That's not what God wills or wants. But I want to jump back to verse 25 through 27 because this is something that has led to a lot of contention throughout history. In particular, during like the Middle Ages, and you even hear it in like Shakespeare's plays, kind of this connotation that Jews are kind of greedy. And part of it is from this, because you will not lend to your people at interest. Well, who are my people? Okay, I can lend to the Gentiles, the non-Jews, at high interest and take all this back off of them. And I think it also just shows this doesn't really have to do with insurance, but I think it goes hand in hand with this wanting security, right, for those things when you lend. And I don't know if you know this, but until about 70 years ago, at least in the Lutheran Church, I can't remember with the other church bodies, but our active policy was essentially that it was sinful to get life insurance or housing insurance or any of those kinds of things because it wasn't trusting in God, and it took the responsibility out of the community's hands to provide for and care for the people in need in your community.
That's wild.
But I mean, there's something beautiful about that, right? Because now we see, as it's been outsourced to these companies, how greedy it is, how often they don't want to hand out claims. You go through months trying to get anything done. You know, we have a member who lost her house, and it's been a constant battle with the adjuster and the insurance claim and the contractors because they're not going to do any work, rightly so, until they know they're going to get paid. And the insurance won't tell them how much they can do or how much is covered until, you jump through 9 hoops. So, nothing ever gets done. And usually, who loses out? The people who are paying for this service that they often don't actually receive. And so it's this thing driven by greed and not driven by actual care for the community. So we've outsourced, in a lot of ways, our ability to provide for our neighbor and be compassionate. Now, with the way our culture is and the system that we have, I don't know what other options we have at this point. We're kind of just into whatever reality we now face. But I think it's interesting that was kind of the practice, and we got away from it, and I think it's to our detriment, if I'm honest.
Well, I think in our culture, too, we just have so much more to lose than in this culture. It was just... It was
material possession-wise.
It was a simpler time.
Sure.
And they were, nomadic, and, it was... Yeah, we have a lot more to lose now.
Well, and even in the 50s, when I think that's when it switched. But even then, the amount of electronics we had was way less. You had your home, but then you had basically a fridge, an oven, and maybe a mixer. Like,
Sure.
you didn't have every other gadget under the sun and a million toys and a million of all these other things. You had just a few things. Mm-hmm. And so it's just interesting how this changed and how the perception of that has shifted, and we've moved away from that. And so in a lot of ways, we don't actually take that active role in caring for our community. And, we bought a new to us car, and we were lamenting how even just in a few years, like, the interest rate has varied greatly. Mm-hmm. And just lending it interest, which is really about the people just gaining a profit for themselves. And,
right.
I mean, all the reforms to, like, college tuition and those kinds of loans, student loans that were privately done before, that were taking advantage of students and charging, 15-20% interest on the loans, that kids that didn't know any better. Mm-hmm. And I know the older generation likes to blame the younger kids for getting stupid degrees, but it was them who told us to get degrees, and then told us we had to go to college and needed us to get a job, and then basically took advantage.
And it was them who lended us the money.
Yep.
I mean, yeah.
So it's a whole system that was really predicated on greed. Mm-hmm. And this whole section from 25 to 27 is really about showing being compassionate towards those in need and those who are less fortunate, to provide for them and not give them away to get what they need but keep them in poverty, but to actually just care for them. Mm-hmm. And make sure you didn't also get taken advantage of. And right, it also knows that, like, even if you take the cloak and pledge, make sure you give it back to them. Make sure that they have all they need. And that's not the approach we take at all. So, just like you said, a vastly different cultural time, but I think there's something that we've lost today. And then, man, I could go on for hours on verse 28, but maybe we should just take that to heart, that we should not curse a ruler of our people. And I know that this is not quite the same as the kingship of Israel, but as we note later in the Old Testament, when King Cyrus, who's not a Jew, is installed as a ruler and has charge of the people of Israel, and in the New Testament, whether or not they're of our tribe, if you will, we're still not supposed to revile the leader of who's overseeing and governing us, because they're the ones that God has put in that position. And so the thing we're called to do is pray for them. Doesn't mean we have to agree with every policy, but that's not really the posture we take. Most of what I see is vitriol towards leaders, or defense of sinful behavior because they're of my ilk.
Yes.
And neither one of those is right. We want to pick it back up in chapter 23.
Do not spread false reports. Do not help a guilty person by being a malicious witness. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd, and do not show favoritism to a poor person in a lawsuit.
So, I mean, this all makes sense, right? But it's this idea of having uprightness, justice, and truth in all that we do. And these are really about having impartial justice to maintain a society. You need that. Otherwise, if people can buy their innocence, then justice is subverted entirely, right? And I think we've seen kind of how that has played out a little bit in America lately, with the attitude towards I can't remember the guy's name, but he's the one who killed the head of the health insurance agency. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't.
So the guy that went in and shot the guy that was like the head of some health insurance company.
Okay.
And there was a lot of sympathy from the regular people toward him because of the fact that so many, like, he was denied coverage, family was denied coverage, all the other things of being taken advantage of. And then we see the rich and powerful who do heinous crimes. And not that I think his crime wasn't heinous, it certainly was, but who have done all kinds of things and get a slap on the wrist or get probation, and because they can afford a better lawyer or can, they just have the advantages that come with wealth. And so justice, in a sense, is perverted. It's not actually blind. it seems to care a lot about how much resources you have, which is just really unfortunate. And it leads you to undermine and question whether or not justice is actually prevailing in our society. And so I think we, as people, generally I agree with this idea of impartiality, but we always think that our circumstances deserve special consideration. You want to continue on?
If you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to return it. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you fallen down under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help them with it. Do not deny justice to your poor people in their lawsuits. Have nothing to do with a false charge, and do not put an innocent or honest person to death, for I will not acquit the guilty. Do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds those who see and twists the words of the innocent. Do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt.
So, again, building on that same idea of how important justice is, but I think verse 4 and 5 in particular hit at the fact that we don't get to show preference, because it starts, right, with, if you meet your enemy's donkey. And so we're not supposed to let our attitude towards others impact whether or not we help them and whether or not we seek what's best for them. And that's really uncomfortable for us, right? To want the blessing on our enemies and on those who oppress us or hate us. And I think this also reflects God's nature of helping and caring for us, right? That Romans 5, I think it's verse 8, notes that while we were still enemies of God, that Christ came and died for us, right? It's not while we were trying real hard to seek him and we just couldn't make it. Like, while we were actively opposed. My song is Love Unknown has the line, then crucify is on their lips. And kind of that, is it there or is it another song? Where it says, my voice joins among the scoffers. I think that's in that hymn. And that's the reminder that we like to think, oh, I can't believe those people crucified Jesus. But had we been there, we either would have been fleeing like the disciples and failed him in that way, or we would have been those shouting crucify. Like, we were enemies of God by nature, because at least apart from Christ, when we hear, like we said, the laws of the Ten Commandments and all those things, if the standard is perfection, we know that we don't meet the standard. The judge should rightly condemn us. And there's a reason that I don't think you can know God's character apart from Scripture. Right? We can say we can know God. Paul says, like, none of us have an excuse because God's attributes are manifested in creation. Right? So we can know he's creator. We can know he loves beauty. We can know these things. But you can't know his compassion from creation. You can't experience his mercy from creation itself, especially since it's been broken, right? So we see animals eat animals, survival of the fittest. We would think that either if we recognize the moral and natural law, that we know we don't always keep it, so we should be judged, or if we just look out at the world, we see how it all seems arbitrary. And so the only way we really come to know God and know his character and compassion is through Christ and through Scripture. And I think this kind of parallels Luther's explanation in the Small Catechism, that we're supposed to want the benefit of our neighbors constantly. We're supposed to work for what's best for them. And it kind of parallels, I think, Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. The guy's trying to ask, well, who's my neighbor? Who do I really need to help? And really the point of that parable is, well, the one you hate and whoever's in front of you in need. You don't get to decide based on their religious affinity, their political preference, their whatever animosity of whether or not they are deserving of help. It's if they're in front of you and in need, you ought to help them. That's heavy.
It's convicting.
Yeah. And to be sure, we can't do that perfectly. And let's be honest, Jesus didn't help every single person who had any need in front of him while he was here on earth, right? He didn't heal every illness, every stub toe, he didn't make everyone's ills go away. So we have to recognize our own limits. But if we see somebody in need, have the capacity and go, yeah, but I'd rather not because they're that skin color, or I know they put this political sign in their front yard, then I think we don't actually like what God has to say and aren't actually following God's commands.
Also, in verse 9, we have what you were mentioning in the last podcast about how when God tells the Israelites to, treat the foreigner or those that are, less than in the community well, he harkens back to when they were foreigners.
Yeah. And, this is a challenge of modern society, I guess. That might be the way to put it, where we have borders and travel is far more accessible and possible than it ever was back then, right? Like, we can fly across the world and come into a new country. And so, like, dealing with this while also thinking about the political ramifications of some of those things is complex. And there are laws and there are those other things, but whether or not we agree with them being here or not, the reality is if they're in front of us, we're called to care for them. Now, we may say, hey, if you really want to live here, we should follow proper protocols. Let me help you try to find the right way to get into our country or whatever else it might be. But we shouldn't withhold care for them if they're in front of us. And I don't know that that's how many people in our country would view it. And that's challenging. It's challenging to live. I think we would all like for everything to be black and white. And so much of living it out in our context is trying to take the next right step in faithfulness in the gray. And sometimes we take the next right step in good faith and realize, man, that wasn't the right thing I should have done. And that's where there's repentance and there's forgiveness. But we try to love those in front of us. So picking it up at verse 10. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat. And what they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. You shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. Pay attention to all that I have said to you, and make no mention of the names of other gods, nor let it be heard on your lips. 3 times in the year you shall keep a feast to me. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread, as I commanded you. You shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days, at the appointed time in the month of Abib. For in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty-handed. You shall keep the feast of harvest of the firstfruits of your labor, of what you sow in the field. You shall keep the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in from the field the fruit of your labor. 3 times in the year shall all your males appear before the Lord God. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, or let the fat of my feast remain until the morning. The best of the firstfruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. So, let's start with just talking about the Sabbath and reminding ourselves that this is meant to be a gift for all. And there's the rhythms of Sabbath, of the weekly Sabbath, and then the seasonal Sabbath with these festivals. And we'll talk about it later, but the 7 years Sabbath. And it's so that the point of that, of all of those, is in part that there is food for the poor and needy as the land rests and food grows on its own. That's part of the purpose of Sabbath, is God providing for those who are poor and needy. And there is also a law, it's not written here, but it's in, I believe, Leviticus, where it says that it's legal for people to grab what fell in the field and from the corners. Those not mentioned here. And that it was a law that we're supposed to leave the corners of the field unharvested. So that's a way of caring for the poor and needy. So it's kind of like having a food bank here and now today. Obviously, we live in a different context. We're not entirely a agrarian society when most of us live in the cities, but it was a way to make sure that those people were cared for, were watched over, and provided for. So we don't simply say, well, I'm sorry, you should get a job, you should get it together. Good luck trying to figure out your food. We're supposed to still care for them and provide for what they need. And I think in this section with the 3 festivals, we kind of have what functions essentially like a liturgical calendar today. Right? It's times that have high feasts and high seasons. And these festivals are brought up again in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. And as it notes in this section, they coordinate with the three main harvests. So the first harvest of grain, which is the early barley, is Passover. That's what that festival is. And then the harvest of other cereal crops happens 7 weeks later. So that's grain, wheat, and spelt. And that's Pentecost or Weeks. Those are the two names that get used for that. And then the final harvest of all the crops in autumn is the festival of ingathering, also called tabernacles or booths. And so those are the three main festivals. And for all of these, the men had to make a pilgrimage to the holy site. So they had to come and present themselves before God and make an offering. And so their rhythm of Sabbath and their rhythm of the yearly calendar was centered around giving thanks for the gifts that God gave to provide for their health and well-being, their food, their survival for the year. So some of our festivals obviously coordinate with these now in light of Christ, right? We have the festival of Passover obviously goes with Easter and Good Friday. Pentecost is still called Pentecost. And then the fall harvest would probably be around the time of Thanksgiving. And then we have verse 18 talks about not offering anything leavened. Why would you not offer anything with leaven?
I don't know.
So leaven in the Old Testament is often associated with sin. That's why you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You've been made holy, set apart from sin. Because what happens when you put leaven into even a small portion of like the loaf?
It grows.
It leavens the whole thing, right? Sin infests the whole thing. And so leaven is a symbol for that. So that's often why they have this idea of giving things that are pure and holy that aren't tainted by that, which is an interesting side note. It's often the analogy is that leaven is a symbol for sin in the Old Testament.
So I need to stop making sourdough?
No, because it's delicious. Also, it's only for certain festivals.
Oh,
and for the offerings to God. Are you bringing up sourdough bread for with the offering?
No, I did bring it to church a couple weeks ago, though.
Yeah. But it's for these festivals, because obviously they can have leaven at the other times. And then we have, obviously, the first fruits. So this is kind of where you get the tithe and some of those other things from. The tithe is also commanded. But the point is, you should give your first and best to God, not just the leftovers, recognizing that really everything comes from his hand. It's not from our own ability, so we give him first and trust that he's going to provide out of the rest for us.
I think about that every month where we have had a really a bunch of car repairs or something, and I'm worried about the next month, and I'm like, oh, maybe we should wait to do offering until we see how things are. And then I'm like, no, I'm just going to do offering and I'm going to trust God. And that went through my head last month because we had a massive car repair and then our other car broke down.
Yep. Well, and I think part of the reason it's not commanded here, and I don't think it gets commanded in Exodus, but part of the reason I think that they designated the tithe, which is not mandatory on Christians. Paul will note that God loves a cheerful giver and not begrudgingly. But I think the reason 10% is suggested and is actually worthwhile. And if you've never tithed, don't go there immediately. I would say work your way up there to build up to that, if that's what you want to do. But the reason I think a tithe or 10% is good is because it's enough that you feel it. Mm-hmm. And, if you're making an offering and this is kind of our sacrifice to God in a sense, it shouldn't be something so insignificant or small that you don't even notice it, that you're not making a sacrifice at all to God. At least that's the way I've come to understand it and think about it. Because God was willing to give up everything for us, and so it's that reminder, hey, we're going to give enough that maybe it's going to be a little tight or inconvenient, but we're also trusting then that God is going to provide what we actually need, because he knows. This is a whole side note. I could go down this rabbit trail probably far too long, but since we were talking about caring for the poor already in this section, there's the story where Jesus is watching the people put into the temple, and the woman puts in the half penny or whatever it is, and it's all she has, and Jesus praises her, and it says, like, she's trusting in God. And I hate how that is often preached on and talked about, because it's the beginning of a new chapter. And for those of you listening, if you didn't know, the chapters and verses were added later. They don't exist in the original text. And so what's immediately preceding this is Jesus criticizing the Pharisees and the scribes and the teachers who tithe mint and dill and cumin and all these things and don't care at all about the widows and the orphans and devour them for a pretense. And then the next thing he says is, look at her. She has nothing to live on, and you're not providing for her, and she's giving everything she has. It's not that Jesus is saying, look, she is this prime example, as much as, why should she be giving everything she has and have nothing if you have all of this and don't care for the poor? I think that's the actual point of the sermon. And so often it's preached like, well, if you really loved God, you would give everything you have. I think the church's responsibility is actually to care for and provide for the poor, as this whole section seems to be indicating. Mm-hmm. But that's not the way it's often taught. It's often like shaming the people who are committed but are living on little. And it's like, if you can't afford your rent, God doesn't want you to be homeless so you can give an extra $5. It should be those who have money who are caring for and taking care of those needs. Not that you shouldn't give, but anyways. That's a rabbit trail that hopefully was worthwhile. And then, what do you make of the end of verse 19?
I don't have any problems with it.
You don't have a problem with the fact that you should not boil a young goat in his mother's milk?
Yeah, I have no problem following that rule. I have never cooked a young goat in his mother's milk. If the thought's never occurred to me, it's never been a temptation.
Well, good for you.
I know. Yeah. Not a stumbling block for me.
Every time I read this and I get to this section, and it comes up a few other times, I'm like, why is that mentioned here? I don't understand. Like, it doesn't make sense. But, so I'm fairly certain is this is talking about offerings and other things that are being given. And so what most people believe is that this was a Canaanite cult practice associated again with fertility for the land and for people. And as I was thinking about that this morning, I was thinking about how many like weird, I don't know if wives' tales is the right word, but like the things that are handed down, like, you want to have kids? Put the garlic here in your bed, whatever it is, that like the ancient people, not ancient people, but a couple of generations ago thought would make this help in some way, shape, or form. Mm-hmm. And I feel like it's kind of like that, a superstition, and we're not supposed to be superstitious people. As Michael Scott says.
Can we be a little stitious?
We can't be a little stitious. A little stitious, but not superstitious. But I think it's about those things and not falling into the practices of the people around that were designed to think that you can manipulate God again. At least I think that's what's going on there. And again, today, it is like people who will go and buy crystals or try and get their chakras cleansed or whatever else it is that they think will manipulate these forces and bring blessings or benefits. That's very similar to, I think, what is happening here.
Continuing in verse 20. See, I am sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way and to bring you to the place I have prepared. Pay attention to him and listen to what he says. Do not rebel against him. He will not forgive your rebellion, since my name is in him. If you listen carefully to what he says and do all that I say, I will be an enemy to your enemies, and I will oppose those who oppose you. My angel will go ahead of you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and Jebusites, and I will wipe them out.
Wait, you forgot, as when I normally read this, that we add, and the Miller Lights and Bud Lights and Natty Lights and
No.
Bush Lights? Okay, sorry, continue then.
Verse 24. Do not bow down before their God or worship them or follow their practices. You must demolish them and break their sacred stones to pieces. Worship the Lord your God, and his blessing will be on your food and water. I will take away sickness from among you, and none will miscarry or be barren in your land. I will give you a full lifespan. I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you encounter. I will make all your enemies turn their backs and run. I will send the hornet ahead of you to drive the Hivites, Canaanites, and Hittites out of your way, but I will not drive them out in a single year, because the land would become desolate and the wild animals too numerous for you. Little by little, I will drive them out before you until you have increased enough to take possession of the land. I will establish your borders from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, and from the desert to the Euphrates River. I will give into your hands the people who live in the land, and you will drive them out before you. Do not make a covenant with them or with their gods. Do not let them live in your land, or they will cause you to sin against me, because the worship of their gods will certainly be a snare to you.
So, first of all, let's comment just on the end of this section that God is going to do it gradually. So, God understands logistics and how things happen. And so sometimes I think that's also a good reminder for us when we're working towards something, that sometimes God limits the pace at which something happens so that we can handle it, so that we can gradually grow or gradually change and fill the things in a way that is healthy and that is good for us, so it's not overrun. So I think that's just interesting that God he does condescend and accommodate to who we are and the realities of our capacity, which is, I think, really comforting in a lot of ways.
It's also just interesting the ways God chooses to act miraculously and then not miraculously.
Yeah, well, and that, we'll circle back to the early part because I want to talk about that in a minute, but yours said, I think, and I will send the hornet before you, right, in verse 28, singular.
Mm-hmm.
Mine says hornets. It can be either way. And so the question is, that people have and debate, is whether it's to be taken literally as like actual hornets or not, or if that's like the name for the angel or whoever it is that's going to drive them out. I mean, with the rest of this passage, I actually don't think it's implausible to believe it's literal hornets, right? Like, that would make me want to leave if there was an infestation of hornets in that area. I was stung multiple times last year around our home. It didn't make me want to leave the house, but I certainly didn't like it. And if I didn't have windows and screens and couldn't get inside, I'd probably be like, can we move somewhere else? And so it could be that. And I think that's just interesting that we don't exactly know what this means, and people have taken it both to be like the nickname for something or to understand it as actual hornets. There's no clear way to reconcile that, but the point is that God was going to go in front of them in some way. And either way, I think, is miraculous of driving people out. Maybe it's a literal way that God just makes their life uncomfortable. And the reality, the sad reality as we think about the end of this, is that the Israelites will never actually drive all these people out because they don't stay committed. They constantly compromise, and thus they miss out on the full blessings that God had promised in this section. And so they miss out on that. But I think we need to go back to verse 20 to 22, because it says, I'm going to send an angel before you, but notice there are some interesting things about this angel, particularly in verse 21. They're supposed to pay attention to him and obey his voice, and if they rebel against him, he will not pardon your transgression. Who alone can forgive sins according to the Old Testament?
God.
So there's something going on with this. It's unusual language if it's just one of the messenger angels. So we take this to be the incarnate Christ going ahead of them, which fits with how Paul understands it in Corinthians, and his name is in him.
Right. I was going to bring that up.
So this is clearly something deeper is going on here than just the messenger. It's not just an angel, it's the angel of the Lord. And if you carefully obey his voice, then these things will happen. And I think, so we have kind of, even here then, this idea that there's going to be a messenger whose voice God's people need to listen to in order to receive forgiveness, in order to receive the blessings of God, which fits very well with how Jesus talks about himself in the New Testament too. As we see, again, the Old Testament people have not the full revelation, but still those things that foreshadow exactly what is said to us. And again, when we think about us, this is what we would say, how apart from Christ there is no salvation, right? There is no forgiveness apart from coming to the Father through him. If we can say we believe in God, but if we disbelieve Jesus, we actually don't. We've rejected the Father and the one he sent to accomplish all those things.
Continuing in chapter 24. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. You are to worship at a distance, but Moses alone is to approach the Lord. The others must not come near, and the people may not come up with him." When Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws, they responded with one voice, "Everything the Lord has said we will do." Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. He got up early the next morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in bowls, and the other half he splashed against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. They responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you, in accordance with all of these words."
All right. So, very comfortable, right? We would happily do that here and now, right?
No, we're not really into blood being sprinkled on us.
Yeah, this is just uncomfortable to read, I think, in a lot of ways. I want to make a comparison that I think we can see here, where Moses is kind of set up as the chief example of an Old Testament prophet, from the threat to his life at his birth to the promise later in Deuteronomy that there will be a prophet like him, and that joins up with the statement that we'll see at the end of Deuteronomy that no one like him has yet arisen, so we should expect someone more. And we're supposed to look for someone else in the type of Moses who would come later. And Moses, as we commented, I think, way back at the beginning of this podcast, kind of has this connection to Noah. Do you remember the connection to Noah? So, the word for basket
is ark.
Is ark. And both of them are saved out of the water, right? And so there's kind of this similar connection. And so they both have this deliverance out of the water. And then both, as they come out, there's a covenant being made, in a sense. So I like to think about it this way. Both Noah and Moses mark the beginning of new eras for humanity and for the people of Israel, right? The restarting of humanity in Noah after the flood, and now Israel being called out as the new people of God, a new humanity for the blessing of the world coming through the Red Sea in particular. And so we kind of have, after the baptism of the world in the flood waters of God's wrath, God makes a covenant with Noah, right? The rainbow. And then after the baptism of the army of Pharaoh in the waters of judgment at the Red Sea and of the people passing through, God makes a covenant with Moses. That's where we're getting to being ratified here. And then if we jump forward, after the baptism that Jesus undergoes, according to Mark 10:38, what's the baptism that Jesus undergoes? Not his literal baptism. What's the other one? I'm about to be baptized.
His death?
His death at the cross. So he says, I'm going to be baptized with a baptism which with you guys cannot be baptized. That's when they say, can we come and be at your right and your left-hand side of your kingdom? Right? The apostle, or the disciples. And so he experiences the fulfillment of the outpouring of God's wrath at the cross. And then God makes a new covenant with him, right? Through Jesus, for the new people of God, the church. So Israel was not merely delivered from the waters of death in the Red Sea, but through them, they were dying to the old life in Egypt in the process, and were being prepared for the new life with God in the land of Canaan. And that's what all of this is kind of about, right? Preparing for where they're going to go into the promised land. And so even as Noah was delivered through the waters of death, dying to the old creation, so as to live in the present one, so too we, through our baptism into Christ, into his judgment, are brought in die to the old man, and are made a new Adam, a new man in Christ now. And so there's this connection to judgment and covenant and all these things that are parallel that jump forward. And I think that's kind of really interesting and really cool.
So is that connected to, like, the blood being splattered on them? Is that a connection you're making?
Well, I'm kind of, yes, in part, but also going back all the way through what's led up to this point in Exodus.
Oh.
Right, that they've now passed through all of this. They passed through that judgment, and now they're coming to the new covenant being made. So this is where they're being ratified as a new people of God. And we'll talk more about some of that next time. I'm going to wrap up with just one kind of last comment, I think, and then we'll pick it up next time, which is just that in this section where it says that Moses goes back up to tell the people what God has said, I think he's come down, and the Ten Commandments were given earlier, but he hasn't told them until here and now. So when they're reported earlier, I think that's him hearing them, or you could understand God having spoken them to them directly. But I think here and now, with these other clarifications, is when Moses actually speaks to them.
Sure, that makes
And
sense.
it's interesting that it said he wrote them down, which this is the first time, or not first time, it's one of the early times where something is written down, which I think shows to its permanence and enduring nature, especially in an oral culture. You don't write down a whole lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. So something significant has just happened. But I think we're kind of at the time where we should stop here and pick it up next time as we build on this.